Hello, and welcome to the next video on the Divine Liturgy, where we're going to be talking about the readings, specifically the Epistle and the Gospel. So let's start off with the Epistle, specifically with some commentary. St. Maximus the Confessor says that the Epistle is the instruction in Christian life. St. Germanos says that the Prokeimenon and Alleluia are the prophecies of the coming of Christ. St. Nicholas Kavasilas says that it's the manifestation of Christ in his teaching to the apostles. And St. Simeon of Thessaloniki says it's the mission of the apostles to the Gentiles. Moving over to the Gospel commentary, St. Maximus the Confessor says the Gospel represents the end of the world and the second coming of Christ to judge the world. St. Germanos says that it's the revelation of God brought by Christ, and the bishop's blessing after the gospel is the second coming. St. Nicholas Kavasilas says the gospel represents the manifestation of Christ in his teaching to the crowds. And St. Simeon of Thessaloniki says it's the proclamation of the gospel in all of the world. The first instance we see of the readings in the Divine Liturgy come from commentary from the Apostolic Constitutions in the 4th century. They may have been added earlier, adapted from Jewish temple readings. This could have accompanied with the Eucharist during the Apostolic Age. They consisted of Old Testament readings, the Epistle, letters from Paul, or Acts, and the Gospel. We then had the Old Testament readings being removed by the 8th century, as it was very lengthy. But they wanted to keep the Epistle and the Gospel, so Old Testament readings were dropped and replaced by the Prokeimenon, which were adopted from Psalms. Yet you will still see the Old Testament readings in services such as Vesperal Divine Liturgy and Presanctified Divine Liturgy. So when it comes to the Epistle, it can typically be done by a tonsured reader or subdeacon, but any baptized Orthodox Christian can do it. It could be a man, it could be a woman, it could be an adult, or it could be a child, so long as they know how to read. Mostly consists of New Testament epistles, mostly like the letters of Paul. Although the book of Acts is read from Pascha through Pentecost and a few other feast days. Moving over to the Gospel is read either by the deacon or the priest. The readings of the Gospel follow a cycle based on feasts and the liturgical calendar, typically with something with like the Mannaeans. Lent, Pascha, and Pentecost all have set readings, where it's not based off of the day of the year in terms of calendar date, but more towards the liturgical calendar date. For unfixed readings, such as times of the year, there may be different combinations of epistles and gospels not seen for many years, just because of which day of the week they fall on, or where they relate to in terms of the Paschal cycle. So let's go to the diagrams that I had shown previously with the little entrance, showing some of the liturgical movement. So during the Trisagion, the altar servers are lined up on either side of the sanctuary bearing torches. No fans or cross are needed for the readings. When the deacon then says, "with strength," the altar servers will then go out near the stairs, and then a reader, in this case, a tonsured reader or a layperson, will then come up holding the epistle book. During this time, the deacon will then have the reader read the Prokeimenon, and then saying, "Let us attend," where the reader will then read the epistle to the people. Meanwhile, the priest will then be censing around the altar with the censer throughout the entire reading. After the readings, the priest is then in front of the altar and dismisses the reader, where he then is taking the gospel book, or the deacon will, and is then led, either the priest or the deacon, in front on top of the stairs, where he will then read the gospel. After the priest finishes reading, he returns into the sanctuary in front of the altar, and 2 by 2, the altar servers bearing their torches bow before the altar and go back their respective doors into the sanctuary. In terms of movement for altar servers and clergy regarding the epistle and the gospel readings, nothing really changes too much if either of them are done during different types of services, vesperal or like pre-sanctified, if there is any type of reading. The only time that the altar servers would not actually be out there with their candles is during the Old Testament readings. The altar servers are actually behind in the sanctuary during that time. So what is the purpose of reading both the epistle and the gospel during the Divine Liturgy at this time? Well, for the most part, it's helped to kind of cleanse our souls and realize the manifestation of Christ within them, because later on in the service, if you are partaking, you'll be introduced with the Eucharist. So you want to prepare yourself, kind of like how where you prepare yourself for communion also with confession. It's another way of helping your mind and reading the words of the apostles and the words of Jesus. Another interesting question to ask yourself is, why exactly do you read the epistle first, then the gospel? Well, some commentators that I had talked about previously in a lot of these other videos, and this one as well, have mostly said that, if you think about it, the message of God is a little bit difficult to understand just from person to person. So with the epistle, you're taking the words of a human to a human that were inspired by God, but then following it up is the message from Jesus. So you get this gradual increase in terms of clarity of the message that God is giving you, what Jesus is giving you through these words in both of these books of text. So at the conclusion of these readings, there would typically be a homily sermon done afterwards. Between the anarxis and then the homily, you would have something that was known as the Liturgy of the Catechumens. This is where everybody would be able to come to the church and listen in during the service. However, in ancient times, this was then followed by what we now know as the Liturgy of the Faithful, which we'll be talking about in the remaining videos, which focus on the Eucharist. So after the homily, people who are catechumens or inquirers or visitors would leave the church. However, this is not typically done today. So as of right now, we have finished what is part of the Liturgy of the Catechumens, the anarxis, the little entrance, the epistle, gospel, and then the homily, but that didn't really need its own video. So that is the Liturgy of the Catechumens. For the future videos, which will then be followed by this video, we will have the Liturgy of the Faithful, which goes from the Great Entrance all the way to the dismissal after communion. Thank you for joining me today in this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye!